Welcome to another episode with Security CISO. And today, to have this discussion, I have not an IT professional, but a trauma-informed psychologist. And she's here to share with us as to what really happens when people in IT go through a crisis day. And when I call it a crisis day, is a day when they get to know that their organization has been hacked or a critical system has been ransomed. Or there are times when these professionals will have to work with limited information. They also have to be on the alert all the time, need to keep them updated regularly, work under pressure with respect to time, and also team dynamics. And there are times they will have to make decisions with very limited information or unknown information. So to have this discussion, we have a business consultant and a trauma-informed psychologist, Shihana Ganegoda. Thank you so much, Shihana, for joining us on this platform to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So, Shihana, what does the human mind or the body actually go through when they are faced with a situation, I would say, fight or flight response during a crisis? In my mind, what I have when I say crisis is about a cyber crisis, and how does it affect a typical decision-making process?
Yeah, so I think first of all, before we come into this context, how our human brains respond to the threat or to any danger is quite the similar. It's very similar. So even if you're being chased by a lion, or even if you're in a medical situation, or even if you are going through a crisis situation now, like a cyber attack you mentioned, how our brains respond to this threat or danger, it's quite similar, right? So usually what happens first, our sensory organs, we process what's going on around us. And then this goes to our brain, and then the amygdala detects the threat, and then it starts scanning for more danger. And then when this happens, there's another signal being sent to our hypothalamus, which is responsible for our stress response. And then this is when our sympathetic nervous system gets activated and then releases the adrenaline into our system. So when adrenaline is released, this is when our blood pressure increases, our heartbeat races, and then we start breathing much more rapidly. So these are all the physiological impacts the release of adrenaline has on our physical body. So this is again our way. It's how the brain, or rather our body, starts responding to this threat. So again, the adrenaline is also what's responsible for our fight or flight, like you mentioned. So next, again, if this threat continues to exist, then again, there's another signal being sent to our HPA axis. So this is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenaline axis. So this is responsible for the release of cortisol. So cortisol, initially, it's very important for us because it helps mobilize and sustain our stress response. This helps us elongate our stress response. But again, like you said, decision making, how the whole thing affects decision making is because, again, prolonged accumulation of cortisol has downsides. So that is where decision making can get impaired. So again, the prolonged accumulation of cortisol, it impairs our prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is what's mainly responsible for problem solving, reasoning, your analytical thinking. So when the activity in our prefrontal cortex reduces, the ability for us to think more logically also decreases. We tend to be more reactive in crisis situations. And we are less likely to think much strategically. That is why sometimes the quality of our decisions might lessen. You might make decisions faster, but again, the creativity or the strategic thinking might lessen. So I think that's how stress, cortisol, and the fight or flight impacts our decision making.
Right. So does this also affect or impact on how people sleep, their sleep patterns, appetite, and also the concentration?
Yes, definitely. So again, when we have a lot of cortisol in our body, and when our body goes from our normal thinking mode during a threat, during a crisis, it shifts to survival mode. And when you're trying to survive, our body is always on alert, right? Imagine if I ask you, can you sleep when you get some caffeine in your system? Most of the time, the answer is no. So just like that, when your entire body is on alert, it doesn't help you have any good sleep because your brain and mind is still on alert. It's still working. So the ability for you to rest reduces. It also has cardiovascular impacts because again, your body is under stress. Your heartbeat is on the higher end. Your blood pressure increases. So with all of these things, of course, it's not going to help you have quality sleep. And also when it comes to appetite, you wouldn't have the appetite because most of the energy in your body is taken over by your mind. Because again, it needs a lot of energy. Your brain needs a lot of energy because just like other muscles in your body, your brain is also a muscle. So when it's running on that survival mode, rest becomes very difficult. And also, I think I couldn't mention before, when there's a lot of cortisol involved in our minds, our attention span, our concentration also narrows. We also call this term cognitive tunneling. So that is when you're in a crisis environment, your brain intensely focuses on what's right in front of you, rather the threat or the danger. So when this happens, you lose awareness of what's going around you, which is why sometimes you might miss out on very important information. So I think that is how, again, concentration, attention, and also physical things like appetite and sleep is affected when we are on that survival mode.
Right. So that's pretty. I don't know what word to use. Should I say it's scary? Should somebody be scared about what really happens because they really don't understand the psychological changes? Like you talked about the chemical reactions which happens in the body. Should somebody be concerned about it at all?
So the thing is, again, this is normal human stress response, right? If you're ever to come in contact with any danger, this is how our brain works. Yes, I can understand the psychological terms, all these hormones, knowing about all these, the awareness can sound a bit scary, but even without you knowing, everyday, day-to-day life, when you come across things that are quite uncertain, when your brain perceives anything as a threat or danger, this is what goes on in anyone's brain. So I wouldn't say it's something to be scared of because, again, this is natural human stress response. A lot of things goes on in our brain. It's just natural, but again, now that you're aware about it, you might be thinking, oh my God, a lot is going on. But again, no, it's quite normal.
All right. Okay. Quite normal. That's very nice to hear, I would say, in a very milder tone. I just want to shift the conversation to a public-facing role where when the organizations are facing a hacking incident, which is now in the public domain, where the stakeholders are aware of it, and also where it could be a situation where some of the information probably is out there in the dark web and people keep talking about it in the social media platform. So from an organization standpoint, there could be people who are public-facing roles. And very specifically, I'm talking about the leadership teams or the board members. How would that have an impact on their emotional burden, especially when they are facing the public?
Yeah, so I think as a leader, especially during a crisis situation like you mentioned, when everybody's panicking, they look up to this one person, right? Everybody relies on the leader. And like you mentioned, when they are public facing roles, when they're also a leader of an organization, they're looking at a lot of competing priorities, right? So they have to look after themselves, they look after their teams, and then they also have to face their organization and also the public, other stakeholders. So these are, again, a lot of competing emotional needs. And there is a lot of emotional labor, I think, that goes around all of these, because again, like I said before, you're trying to manage your own emotions, your team's emotions, your organization's emotions, and at the same time, you're also trying to be that public figure, trying to face the media. So that is all. I think this is the most least recognized yet the most demanding part of leadership, because nobody really speaks about the emotional burden you go through in these situations. And also, as a leader, I think you're expected to contain your emotions, right? Sometimes you yourself might not know what exactly is happening. There might be a lot of uncertainty. In times like that, sometimes a leader wouldn't go there and tell how you actually feel. Even when you're talking to your executive board or when you're going to these meetings, you might not actually say that you're feeling these things. There might be a lot of guilt, fear, shame, anxiety, a lot going on, but you wouldn't get to communicate these things even with your team or with your executive board for that case. So there is a big gap between the emotions felt and what you try to display. Right? Internally, you might be going through a lot of negative emotions, yet externally, you try to maintain that calm, that confidence. You're trying to be that hopeful, reassuring leader to everyone. Again, emotional contagion or managing and regulating our emotions is quite important, right? So if you take an example of let's say a medical scenario where a surgeon is doing an open heart surgery. So every time they come across a complication, if they cry and break down, would that be sensible? No. So emotional contagion is very important, but at the same time, it doesn't mean you are meant to avoid how you feel. So I think this is where emotional intelligence comes into play. And this is a very popular characteristic I think a lot of recruiters are looking for. Because emotional intelligence is your ability to be able to recognize, be aware of what you're feeling, your ability to also understand other people, your ability to regulate your emotions, and also having those social skills you need to be able to mediate and navigate very stressful scenarios. So I think if you look at healthy leadership, I wouldn't say a healthy leader is someone that avoids their emotions. Rather, it's someone who's aware of what they feel, and this awareness can help them or can ensure that your decisions aren't purely driven by what you feel. Because it's fine for you to accept that you feel anxious, but this awareness will help you to judge if your decisions are purely driven by anxiety or not. Sometimes not having this understanding, you might just act on things. You might just be reactive. You might act out of anger. Your decisions may be driven out of fear. But when you have this understanding, I think it's much easier for you to make sure that your decisions are purely driven by logic and not your emotions. And again, coming back, I think, to the media-facing role. So in a case where you are meant to represent your organization, speak to the stakeholders, I think there is another threat almost that goes in behind this. Because I think in psychology, we call this the social evaluative threat. So sometimes when you are facing media, the questions they might ask are quite direct and also harsh. Right? They might ask things like, weren't you prepared? Did you ignore early warning signs? Did you fail as a leader? So these come off as threats right? They come off as attacks to your identity, your reputation, the career you built so far, and also your competence. So that in itself, again, is a threat. Our brains perceive that as a threat. So that is why, again, it's important that you are aware of how you feel. Because when you have this awareness of your emotional burdens, then you'd be able to manage yourself better.
Right. So the challenge is that they got to face the stakeholders, face the media.
Yeah.
Right. So I just want, on the same tone, I just want to shift the conversation to specifically a role which is the Chief Information Security Officer of an organization. And today, with so much of regulations coming into play, there's a lot of responsibility and accountability placed on their shoulders, right? So there could be situations where these individuals would feel that they're personally responsible, or sometimes, given the circumstances, they may feel isolated. They may also face technical pressure due to specific circumstances. My question is, what do they actually undergo, right? I mean, do their psychological burden differ that of a senior leader, or would they also go through the same feeling?
Yeah, so I think to answer that question again, there is a lot of emotional labor, like we mentioned, that goes around. So emotional labor means we're trying to either manage, suppress, or modify how we feel in order to manage the expectations of your professional role. So again, yes, a lot of these situations, when you're the leader, you tend to take them personally, right? You tend to internalize these thoughts. You try to take the blame on yourself. So that happens again. That's our brain's way of working. Sometimes when you feel like you're responsible for an entire team and organization, you tend to take it on yourself. But again, I think what's important or what helps during these situations is knowing the difference between I made a mistake and also knowing the difference between I made a mistake and that I am a failure. Because I am a failure is something that's quite difficult to deal with. It's quite damaging. And that might trigger feelings of shame. But if you more so accept the thing that you have, maybe made a mistake, this might trigger feelings of guilt. And guilt in this case is quite healthy, because when you feel guilt that you haven't done your responsibility to the fullest, then you're more likely to learn. You would go back, you'd revisit, you'd reflect, you'd try to learn more things. So again, also, like I said, when you are in a stressful situation, your attention span narrows. And we spoke of cognitive tunneling. So sometimes even a cyber attack, a cyber incident might have completely been out of your control. It might have solely occurred due to external reasoning. So sometimes, although the reasoning for the cyber attack were all external, you still might take this personally. You still might have thought, I wish I could have done something. And this is what we call a moral injury, right? So you know that everything was out of your control, but you still tend to take it on yourself. So all of that. And again, it's important that at the end of the day, we realize that you are human as well, because we live in a world that's rapidly developing, this AI that's developing every day. So you can't, again, expect yourself to be on top of everything, to know, be aware of every single thing that's going on around. So at times like this, I think what's important is, again, acceptance. There are things that are in your control, and also there's things that are out of your control. And depending on what happens, making sure you make that distinguish between, if you really accept that you've made a mistake or you've had a shortcoming, then you learn from it, rather than, fixating your mind or internalizing it, thinking you're a failure. Because also it's important that you remember why you are in the role or the position you are in right now, because it's definitely because the organization trusts you enough to carry that title. So in instances like that, I think it's very important that you remember about everything, you've achieved and come so far with as well. I hope that answered the question.
Oh, it did. And actually, it has opened up a set of other questions, right? And I would like to focus one specific area, right? I mean, you did speak about, being responsible because they are responsible in their role, and assuming that, everything was assigned to them, as in like in terms of the resources, the support, and an ideal condition. So if things do go wrong, then you do understand, okay, you did everything in your control at that moment or even before. But the world is not perfect, right? So there could be situations where the CISO may not get the required support from the leadership. When I say the required support, maybe necessary funding to, mitigate a threat, or, to streamline something, or may even engage the right resources. So while the IT cost or the security cost is sometimes treated as a non-essential activity, but just because the regulators require a specific role, the organization might designate an individual to function in that role. May have the competency, may be qualified, but in many cases, we see that, people are appointed to those roles because the regulator wants a designated person. So they may not have the competency, so to say, or the qualifications. In that context, would they be categorized as a typical victim?
Yeah, you can say that, because again, in order to bear such a big responsibility, you need the competence, you need the experience, you need that technical knowledge. But again, if they're not equipped enough to handle the pressure of that role, then they do fall a victim, don't they? Because they're not qualified, or they don't have what is needed to be able to perform well in this role. And we know that under pressure, any human, even a really brilliant surgeon, wouldn't function very effectively, even though they have the best technical knowledge ever, even though they have the skills needed, they might still perform poorly under stress, because we're talking about a very stressful environment here. So even if a brilliant person would fall short on this area when they're in a very stressful situation, how would a person who doesn't have the skills or the competence bear all this pressure? So yes, if that's the case, then they would be a victim. It's not just the pressure they have to deal with then, because they have to improve on their skills. They don't have the knowledge. And again, they might not even have anyone to look up to, especially when you're a leader. A leader usually doesn't have anyone to look up to, because you're meant to be responsible for everything. You're meant to know. People expect you to know answers to everything. So I think, in a case like that, I think that's very unfair on the person who's been hired to that role as well.
I'm going to ask you slightly a different question. Sometimes ignorance is bliss. Right? Most of the time, ignorance is bliss, I would put it, where people get designated not knowing what it is, but when things go wrong, they are made victims. What emotional impact do they go through?
Yes, again, like I said before, it becomes unfair for the person who's hired to that role, right? You're expecting them to do things that they don't even have the skills for. And emotionally, yes, maybe when they got recruited, they might have been really happy about the title they're holding. But again, this title comes with a lot of responsibility. And especially in this context now, when we're talking about cybersecurity incidents, it's definitely more of a risk to the company itself, because we're talking about security here. And if you do that hiring, if you overlook on certain things and hire the wrong person who doesn't have the skills, it's also a threat to your company in that way. And again, emotionally on that person, again, they're going to feel so isolated. because they might have performed really well in the interview, right? They might have answered all the questions correctly. But again, sometimes, yes, you try to fake it till you make it. Maybe it was someone like that. They might have answered everything right, but again, it falls back on your experience, right? Because especially in stressful situations, under pressure, people don't rise to the expectation of the occasion. They just fall back on their training, on whatever experience they have. And that is how we react and act during pressure. We always rely on whatever our past experiences we've had, all the things we have, gone through and learned from. And if they don't have that expertise or that experience, they won't be able to cope up with the whole situation. They might either isolate themselves, they might even come to a point where they have to resign. And again, if it overwhelms their system too much, they may even reach burnout sooner than you think. So yeah, definitely it's unfair on the person, but also I think it's a responsibility of the person applying for such roles to know what is needed, right? You need to understand what the role requires. And if you genuinely don't think you can put up with that role, then it's best you get more experience, and someday you will get there. It's basically again like a surgeon. If the surgeon doesn't have skills, experience needed to do whatever operations or all these difficult medical tasks, you can't give that role to someone who's less experienced, because they wouldn't keep up, and then as a result, it's going to impact on your entire organization.
Absolutely, Shihana. So that brings us to the end of episode 1. And thank you so much, Shihana, for making time to talk about the psychological aspects, what the leadership and the CISO and others undergo during a crisis point, to name a cyber incident. So when we come back, we would talk about burnout. We would also talk about the organizational trauma, recovery and resilience, and how to create a support system. So audience, please stay tuned for our next episode. And those of you who have still not been following us, please hit the like button and also follow us so that you are informed as and when we do a new episode. So watch out for the next episode. Thank you so much.